The first thing Richard Harlow saw when he stormed down the aisle of economy class was a girl. She was young, mid-20s at most, slight, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, wearing a U.S. Army dress uniform. The jacket was hung on her seat hook. She had her head tipped against the window, arms folded across her chest, and she was completely, deeply, unreachably asleep. It was her medals that stopped him mid-stride. There were a lot of them. Rows of ribbons and commendations arranged with geometric precision across the chest of the jacket that swayed gently on its hook as passengers shuffled past. The fabric was dark green, and it fit a person who was, Richard calculated uncharitably, perhaps 5'3", perhaps 120 pounds. A girl, he thought again, playing dress-up. He didn't know, as he settled into the seat across the aisle and pulled out his phone to continue his furious text to his assistant, that 4 men in civilian clothes had spent the last 20 minutes quietly taking their seats in the rows immediately surrounding that sleeping girl. He didn't know that a 3-star general was at this very moment accepting a glass of scotch in row 4, first class, having spent the last 3 minutes looking through the gap in the curtain at the woman in economy with an expression of quiet paternal pride. He didn't know that a 22-year-old college student in row 22 was already holding his phone at an angle that had nothing to do with the game he appeared to be playing. Richard Harlow knew none of this. He looked at the sleeping girl, and he made a decision. That decision would change the trajectory of the rest of his life. Captain Maya Chun had been awake for 31 consecutive hours when she boarded Flight 447 from Reagan National to San Francisco, and she had been in some form of hostile territory for 14 months before that. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a person whose feet hurt. The dress uniform had been waiting for her at the processing facility at Fort Belvoir, pressed, decorated, ready, because someone in the chain of command had decided that Captain Chin would not arrive home in civilian clothes after what she had done. Maya had accepted this without argument. She had learned, over 7 years of service, which battles to pick. The uniform was not one of them. She had, however, booked her own flight home. Economy class, window seat, 28F. Personal credit card. The same one she used for groceries and gas and the occasional paperback at airport bookstores. When Master Sergeant Briggs at the processing facility saw her itinerary and made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a protest, she looked at him until he stopped making the sound. "It's a 4-hour flight," she said. "Captain Briggs." He stopped. This was a thing Maya Chun could do with her name. Place it at the end of a sentence like a period, like a full stop, like a door quietly and irrevocably closing. She had been doing it since she was 19 years old, when a male OCS instructor told her that women didn't belong in the advanced infantry track, and she had waited for him to finish his sentence before saying, calmly, "Chun," and handing him her qualification scores. She'd beaten his personal record by 11 points. The point was not the 11 points. The point was the stillness in which she delivered them. The Army had recognized something in Maya Chun early. Not just the physical capabilities, extraordinary though those were, and not just the tactical intelligence, which was rarer still. What specific people within the Army's most classified corridors had recognized was that Maya Chun processed fear differently from other human beings. Not that she didn't feel it. She felt it acutely. But between the perception of threat and the behavioral response, there was in Maya Chun a pause, a fraction of a second of absolute stillness, that most people simply did not have. In that pause, she chose. Every time, under any conditions. In 14 months in the field, she had chosen correctly every time. 23 people were alive because of it. She didn't think about the 23 people as she settled into 28F and hung her jacket carefully on the hook. She thought about her apartment in San Francisco, which had been sublet to a graduate student and would smell like someone else's cooking. She thought about her sister's daughter, who had been 6 months old when Maya deployed and was now walking. She thought about the particular quality of fog over the bay at 6 a.m. She was asleep before the seatbelt sign illuminated. In the rows immediately around her, for men settled into their seats with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to make themselves unobtrusive in far more dangerous places than a commercial aircraft. Staff Sergeant Marcus Torres took 27D, across the aisle, 1 row ahead. Sergeant James Davis took 29D, directly behind her. Corporal Elena Wright settled into 28E, the middle seat right beside Maya, and spent 30 seconds pretending to search for something in her carry-on before closing her eyes. PFC Daniel Kim was in 30D, 2 rows back, earbuds in, textbook open on his tray. None of them were reading. None of them were sleeping. They were, in the precise technical sense of the term, on watch. Maya had told them, specifically and repeatedly, that this was unnecessary. She was going home. The mission was over. They were free. They had listened politely and then quietly arranged themselves around her anyway, because Marcus Torres had served with Maya Chun in 2 conflicts across 3 continents, and he knew something that Maya's considerable self-awareness had a blind spot about. When the mission was over, she stopped protecting herself. She simply switched it off. The same woman who could hold a defensive perimeter for 6 hours in a collapsing structure would walk through a crowded airport with her carry-on unzipped, because her brain had categorized the environment as safe and was conserving resources. Torres did not consider the environment safe enough to allow Maya Chun to fly home unattended. He had not explained this to her, because she would have told him he was being ridiculous, and she would have been right, and he would have had to agree with her, and she still would have needed watching. In row 4, first class, Lieutenant General Howard Morrison folded his newspaper to the crossword page and accepted a warm dinner roll from the flight attendant. He had learned about Maya's flight 3 hours ago, through a quiet call from Torres, who had passed along the itinerary without fanfare or explanation, because Torres understood that Morrison would want to know. Morrison had booked first class on the same flight. He had not told Maya. There was something he needed to see, needed to verify with his own eyes. After 14 months of receiving classified updates and classified commendations and classified medical reports that never quite captured the human being he'd sent into the field, he needed to see Maya Chun on a civilian aircraft, going home, asleep. He needed to know she was still capable of it. He saw her through the gap in the curtain, head tipped against the window, small and completely still, and he let out a breath he had been holding, he realized, for most of a year. Then he went back to his crossword. The plane began to move. Somewhere in economy class, a businessman in a too-tight blazer looked up from his phone and noticed the sleeping girl. Richard Harlow had built a $400 million company from a Palo Alto garage, been profiled in 3 major magazines, and given a TED Talk with 4.2 million views. He had not, in the last 11 years, flown anything other than business class. Today was therefore an aberration that demanded explanation. The explanation was a computer system error, compounded by an overbooked business class cabin, compounded by the fact that Harlow had been arguing at the gate for 37 minutes while the door was closing. He had been given 2 upgrade vouchers, a travel credit, and a profuse apology, none of which had reduced his sense of injustice by a single degree. He was in 27E, middle seat. His wife Karen, 48, had the aisle. The window seat was occupied by a woman Karen would later identify via Instagram as a minor lifestyle blogger. This social detail mattered to Karen. To Harlow, it was irrelevant. What was relevant was the indignity of his current situation and the question of where to direct the energy it generated. He directed it initially at his phone. His assistant received 7 increasingly pointed texts. Then he directed it at flight attendant Sarah Okafor, who came by with the pre-departure drink service and received a detailed explanation of how unacceptable his situation was, delivered in the tone of a man addressing an employee who had personally wronged him. Sarah listened, her expression professionally neutral, apologized, offered him complimentary whiskey, and moved on. Karen photographed her champagne glass for her Instagram story, making the best of its sparkles, and showed Richard the photo, seeking his approval. He did not provide it. He was looking at the seat across the aisle. "Is that uniform real?" he said. Karen looked. "What? Her?" He nodded toward 28F. "That uniform. Is it real?" Karen studied the sleeping girl with the algorithmic assessment she applied to most visual information. Content value, shareability, narrative potential. "I mean, it looks real. She's military, I guess. She's 23. So, she's a girl." Karen decided not to engage with whatever was taking shape inside her husband's head. She'd been married to him for 19 years. She recognized the particular quality of his attention when it fixed on something he'd decided was wrong. It was the same energy he brought to bad restaurant reviews and the time a neighbor's fence had encroached on their property line by 4 inches. She went back to her phone. Harlow kept looking at the sleeping girl across the aisle. The thing about the uniform, specifically, What bothered him about the uniform was the medals. There were so many of them, rows and rows of ribbons and pins and things he had no names for, and they seemed excessive, theatrical. Real military decorations were earned through years of service. This girl didn't look old enough to have earned this many. It bothered him the way a restaurant bill that didn't add up bothered him. Not out of malice. He would have said this sincerely, but out of a commitment to truth. He was a man who valued truth. He had built his company on it. He had given a TED Talk about it. "Excuse me," he said, across the aisle. The girl did not stir. "Excuse me." Louder. Nothing. Her chest rose and fell with the deep regularity of genuine sleep. Harlow leaned toward Karen. "She's ignoring me. She's asleep, Richard. She's wearing a military uniform. In public. If that's real, she should." He paused, reformulating. People shouldn't be able to just wear military uniforms if they're not actually. She might actually be military. She's a child. The plane lifted from the runway. Harlow settled back, but he didn't stop looking. After 20 minutes, he undid his seatbelt and leaned across the aisle, close enough to read the name tape on the jacket hung on the hook. Chun. The rank insignia was on the collar of the uniform shirt, partially obscured by shadow. He couldn't read it. He could read, however, the nameplate on the top row of ribbons. He sat back, pulled out his phone, typed U.S. Army medals list with pictures. He spent the next 40 minutes cross-referencing. Some ribbons he recognized. Most he didn't. There was one pin near the top, small, dark, precisely made, that returned no results at all. That, somehow, made things worse. He decided that this was because the medals were fake. It made a certain structural sense in the architecture of Richard Harlow's worldview. If something couldn't be verified, it was probably false. If something seemed excessive, it was probably performance. He had built a career on identifying bullshit, on cutting through the noise, on saying the things other people were too polite or too cowardly to say. He would later explain to the FBI agent interviewing him, just trying to be honest. It began quietly. "I'm just saying," Harlow announced to Karen, at a volume calibrated to carry 3 rows in each direction, "that people shouldn't be able to wear military decorations they haven't earned. It's actually a federal crime. Stolen valor. I've read about it." In 2017, Marcus Torres did not turn around. "There are whole organizations dedicated to catching these people," Harlow continued, warming to his subject, because the girl across the aisle had not stirred, and the stillness was beginning to feel like a provocation. "Exposing them. It happens more than you'd think. People want the respect without putting in the work." The lifestyle blogger in the window seat was looking at her phone with the focused attention of someone who has decided to be somewhere else entirely. In 28E, Elena Wright pretended to be asleep. In 29D, James Davis had his eyes closed and his jaw slightly tight. "I'm not trying to be rude," Harlow said, louder still, "but I think the responsible thing." "Sir." Sarah Okafor appeared at his shoulder with the smile she reserved for passengers she'd already assessed as problems. "Can I get you anything?" "Yes. Can you check if that woman has any documentation for her uniform?" Sarah looked at the sleeping woman. She looked back at Harlow. The smile held. "Sir, I'm not in a position to ask passengers for." She's representing the United States military. In public. On this aircraft. If it's legitimate, she can prove it. If it's not. "Sir, I really don't think." "I'm not asking you to think," Harlow said, pleasantly. "I'm asking you to do your job." Sarah Okafor had been a flight attendant for 11 years. She had de-escalated 3 in-flight altercations, helped deliver 2 emergency medical interventions, and once talked a suicidal passenger back from a locked lavatory door with a combination of training and instinct she hadn't known she possessed until she needed it. She was, in all measurable respects, better at her job than Richard Harlow was at understanding the world outside his own experience. She was also alone. Her supervisor was forward, and the woman in 28F was asleep and could not advocate for herself. "I'll see what I can do," she said, which meant nothing, and moved away. Harlow took this as validation. He waited 15 minutes, perhaps for plausible deniability, perhaps because some diminishing part of him was still hoping the girl would wake up and make this easier. And then he leaned across the aisle and shook the armrest of 28F. The girl didn't wake. He shook it harder. In 27D, Marcus Torres turned his head very slowly toward the window. In 28E, Elena Wright opened her eyes. The girl continued to sleep. Harlow felt something shift inside him, some compound of frustration and indignation, and the particular specific wound of being ignored by someone he decided had no right to ignore him. And he reached out and tapped the hanging uniform jacket with 2 fingers. The jacket swayed on its hook. The metals caught the light. For a moment the cabin held its breath. The overhead lights were low, that amber cruise mode twilight, and the rows of ribbons and commendations on Maya Chen's jacket glittered in it like something that shouldn't be touched. Harlow touched it anyway. "Hey," he said. His voice had dropped its performance quality. It was flat now, stripped down to something more genuinely ugly. "Hey, wake up." He grabbed the collar of the jacket and shook it. The jacket fell from its hook. There was a sharp collective intake of breath from the 4 seats immediately surrounding the girl in 28F, the hell-breath quality of 4 people not moving because moving would end something, and whatever ended it would be irreversible. The jacket landed half across the girl's lap. She still did not wake. And this final, unreachable stillness, was what broke Richard Harlow completely. "Take that uniform off," he said, his voice rising past performance, past indignation, into something rawer and smaller and uglier than either. "You lying WH*re." The cabin went very quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't happen by accident. The kind where 32 individual people in various states of distraction or sleep all simultaneously realize something is happening that demands their full attention and give it. In row 22, Brandon Reyes had his phone up and was no longer pretending to play a game. The girl in 28F opened her eyes. It was not a startled awakening. There was no disorientation, no gasping return to consciousness. One moment her eyes were closed. The next they were open, dark brown, clear, and completely, absolutely, terrifyingly calm. She looked at the jacket in her lap. She looked at the medals. She looked at Richard Harlow. In 7 years of special operations service, in conditions that would have shattered most people, Maya Chun had developed a particular relationship with the moment before action. She had learned, the hard way, in places that didn't appear on civilian maps, that the moment before was where everything was decided. The moment before you spoke. The moment before you moved. The moment before the situation became irreversible. She lived in that moment now and looked at Richard Harlow, and she assessed him the way she had assessed every obstacle she'd ever faced, completely, quickly, and without prejudice. She saw a man in his 50s, expensive blazers slightly too small at the shoulders, face flushed in the specific pattern of someone running on adrenaline and wounded pride, hands not quite steady. She saw the wife, phone lowered now, the social confidence gone, watching with the expression of someone who has watched this before and knew how it ended and never managed to stop it in time. She saw the flight attendant, Sarah, standing 3 rows back, frozen between professional obligation and human instinct. She saw, in her peripheral vision, 4 very still men in civilian clothes in the seats around her. She looked back at Harlow. She did not speak. This was the thing that Harlow had not anticipated in any of his calculations, that she would wake up and say nothing. He had expected fear, or tears, or defensive stammering, the automatic flinch of someone caught at something. He had expected the confrontation he'd prepared for, a young woman trying to justify herself to a man who'd already decided she couldn't. He did not expect silence. He did not expect eyes that looked at him with no shock and no anger and no urgency, and found him measurably, assessingly, completely, and then simply waited. "Well," Harlow said. His voice had lost its certainty. What was left without it was thinner. Maya said nothing. "I asked you a question." "I said." "I heard you," Maya said. Her voice was low and even and carried in the quiet cabin without effort. The voice of someone accustomed to delivering information in compressed sentences in loud and dangerous environments. 2 syllables. 3 words. The temperature of the sentence was absolute 0. Harlow blinked. Then, "I'm considering whether to respond," Maya said. She picked up her jacket from her lap. She held it, the metals catching the dim light. Then she looked at it, and at Harlow, and she set it carefully in her lap without putting it on, and she waited. "You're—" Harlow started and stopped. "Mr. Harlow," Sarah began, moving forward. "It's all right," Maya said, without looking at Sarah. "He can finish." She waited. Harlow looked at her. The quiet around them was enormous. 32 people holding still, most of them watching, many of them recording with the discreet angles of people who have learned the etiquette of public documentation. "I want to know if that uniform is real," Harlow said. He had retrieved some of his voice, but it was smaller now, more defensive. "Because those decorations," he gestured at the medals, "are excessive for someone your age. I've done research, and there are people who wear military uniforms without authorization for the respect, and I think the public has a right." He stopped, because something was happening around him. In the seat directly ahead, in 27D, a man was standing up. Marcus Torres stood up slowly. He was 6'1", broad across the shoulders, with a face that had been rearranged slightly by a rock fragment in a country he couldn't name in public, and he was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, and he did nothing except stand up and turn around. He looked at Richard Harlow. He did not speak. "Can I help you?" Harlow said. Torres said nothing. He just stood there, looking. He had the particular quality of stillness that is entirely different from inaction. The stillness of something that is not moving because it has chosen not to move yet, and which contains within it the full awareness that it could move at any time. "Sit down," Harlow said. "This doesn't involve you." Torres continued to stand. In 29D, James Davis stood up. He was quieter than Torres, more precise in how he occupied space, the kind of person who moved through environments in straight lines. He stood, turned, and looked at Harlow with the blank professional attention of a man who had, in his career, been asked to look at people for extended periods from distances measured in hundreds of meters, and then make very considered decisions about what came next. Karen Harlow put her phone down. "Hey," Harlow said, his voice rising. "Both of you sit down. You can't just—" In 28E, Elena Wright stood up. She was almost as small as Maya, 5'4", lean, with short-cropped hair and eyes the color of deep water. She had a scar along her left jaw that she made no effort to conceal, and in context it had a certain communicative power. She looked at Harlow with an expression that contained something specific, familiarity. She had seen men like Harlow before. She had been addressed by men like Harlow before, and she had stood in front of them without moving until they understood she wasn't going anywhere. "This is intimidation," Harlow said, looking around, seeking allies, finding only the carefully neutral faces of people who had already made their calculations. This is. In 30D, PFC Daniel Kim stood up. He was the youngest, 24, lean, with a face that could have belonged to a college sophomore, which was apparently, given Harlow's assumptions about Maya's age, supposed to mean something about capability. He stood up, put his hands in his pockets, and looked at Harlow with an expression that was almost gentle in its steadiness. For people standing in the aisle of economy class, for people who had, between them, served in more contested environments than Harlow had countries on his passport, for people who had, in the last 14 months, followed Maya Chun into situations that would be described in the classified reports Harlow would never read as extreme operational stress and sustained hostile contact, bureaucratic phrases that translated, in human terms, to places where everything tried to kill you. And these 4 people had stood next to Maya Chun while it tried, and they had all come home. They did not threaten Harlow. They did not touch him. They did not speak. They stood in the positions they had taken around the woman in seat 28F, and they were simply present, 4 quiet points of absolute, immovable attention, and the weight of that presence settled over Richard Harlow like something physical. His mouth was open. The flushed confidence of before had drained to something paler. In its place was the expression of a man who has, for the first time, intuited that he has made an error of a kind not fixable by complaints or lawyers or travel vouchers. "What? Who are these?" He looked at Maya. "What is this?" Maya looked at him. "I'll ask you one more time," Harlow said, and the bravado in it was purely structural now, bones without flesh, because his voice was no longer steady. "Take that uniform off. If it's real, prove it. If it's not." "Mr. Harlow." The voice came from the front of the economy cabin. It was a voice shaped differently from most voices, not loud, not forceful, but with the particular resonance of a voice that had spent 40 years being listened to in rooms where listening meant survival. It came from behind the curtain separating economy from first class, which was now being drawn back. Lieutenant General Howard Morrison stepped through it. He was 61 years old and wore civilian clothes, a dark blazer, gray slacks, no insignia. And if you didn't know who he was, you might have said he was simply a distinguished-looking older man, the kind who gets asked for his opinion at dinner parties and gives it economically. If you did know who he was, you noticed something else, the quality of attention that gathered around him as he walked. The flight attendant who had been moving forward stopped immediately. The four snipers remained standing, but their posture shifted, an infinitesimal adjustment. The body's acknowledgement of authority, so deeply trained it happened before the conscious mind engaged. Maya, for the first time, showed a reaction. Not surprise, not relief. Something more complex. The expression of someone seen in a moment they would have preferred privacy, by someone whose opinion of them matters more than they generally acknowledge. She straightened slightly in her seat. Morrison walked down the aisle to row 27 and stopped. He looked across the aisle at Richard Harlow. "I've been sitting in first class," Morrison said, "and I've been listening to you for 40 minutes. His tone was conversational. It was the conversational tone of someone who has no need to be anything else. Harlow stared at him. "Who are you?" "My name is Howard Morrison." A brief pause. "Lieutenant General Howard Morrison, United States Army, Joint Special Operations Command." Another pause, during which Morrison's gaze moved from Harlow to the four standing men. A look that was simultaneously acknowledgement and instruction, nonverbal and efficient. "You can sit down," he said to them quietly. "I've got this." Torres sat. Davis sat. Wright sat. Kim sat. With the same precise economy with which they had risen. Morrison looked back at Harlow. "You've been doing research," Morrison said, nodding at Harlow's phone. "Good habit. Let me add to it." He looked at Maya, who was sitting with her jacket held loosely in both hands, watching Morrison with the calm of someone watching a chess game they are not playing in. "The woman you have been addressing," Morrison said, "is Captain Maya Chun, age 27. She holds a classified rank I am not at liberty to disclose in this setting, but I will tell you that she is the youngest person in the history of the United States Army Special Forces community to hold it." He paused. "She enlisted at 18. She completed Ranger School at 20. She completed Delta Selection at 22, one of 11 people in her class to do so, and the only woman." The cabin was so quiet that the engines, at 38,000 feet, sounded very far away. "The decorations on that jacket," Morrison continued, his voice never rising, "include the Silver Star, awarded for actions in which Captain Chen drew enemy fire away from 6 wounded members of her team to allow medical evacuation, while alone and without cover, for 45 minutes. He let that settle. "The Bronze Star with Valor. The Purple Heart, twice." His eyes moved to Harlow's face, reading it. "That pin you couldn't find in your research, the one at the top, the one that returned no results, has no public documentation. It represents a commendation classified at a level above most elected officials' security clearance." He paused. "Including, I would estimate, yours." Harlow had gone very pale. "The mission she has just completed," Morrison said, "lasted 14 months. I cannot tell you where she was. I cannot tell you what she did, specifically. I can tell you that 23 American citizens who were being held in captivity by a designated terrorist organization came home to their families because of decisions that Maya Chun made, alone, in a collapsed structure, over a period of 6 hours, when her communications were down and her extraction had been compromised, and she had the option of leaving." He stopped. The silence that followed had weight. "She did not leave," Morrison said. Karen Harlow was crying. She was not sure when she'd started. "She has been in the field for 14 months, Morrison said. "She booked economy class because," and here, something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, the professional neutrality warming by the smallest fraction. "She always books economy class. Because she says it's a 4-hour flight. And she has been in places where a 4-hour flight home is not something you take for granted." He looked at Harlow. "She was asleep," Morrison said, "because she is exhausted. Because she has been awake for over 30 hours. Because she is 27 years old, and she has spent the last 14 months doing things in service to this country that you will never know about, and she will never tell you about." Richard Harlow opened his mouth. "I'd think carefully," Morrison said, pleasantly, "before speaking." Harlow closed his mouth. Morrison looked at Maya. Maya looked back at him. Between them passed something that had no useful civilian translation. The look between a commander and the officer he has sent further than it is reasonable to send anyone who came back, and about whom he does not entirely know how to say that he is glad. Captain, Morrison said. Sir, Maya said. Welcome home. Maya looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her jacket, still holding it in both hands, the metals glittering in the cabin light, and she put it on, slowly and precisely, the way she did everything, buttoning each button from the bottom up. When she was done, she smoothed the front and sat back in her seat and looked at Richard Harlow. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The flight attendant, Sarah Okafor, was the first person to move after Morrison finished speaking. She had been standing in the aisle for most of it, professionally frozen, her expression cycling through feelings that were too large for the training to fully contain. She looked at Maya for a long moment, then looked away, because looking at Maya felt suddenly like standing in the presence of something she didn't have adequate vocabulary for. She looked at Harlow instead. Sir, she said, and the word had a different quality now, not the professional warmth she'd been trained to inject into it, but something stripped down and honest. I'm going to need you to return to your seat and remain there for the rest of the flight. Harlow started. Please, Sarah said. It was not a request. Karen tugged at Richard's sleeve. He sat. The cabin exhaled. In row 22, Brandon Reyes had been live-streaming for 22 minutes. He didn't know it yet, but by the time the plane landed, he would have 47,000 viewers and a video that had been shared 11,000 times. He would be interviewed by 3 news outlets by the following morning, and would spend months afterward struggling with the strange gravity of being the person who pointed a phone at something true. He would not, in retrospect, feel complicated about it. For the moment, he simply watched. What he watched next was this. Maya Chun turned in her seat to face forward. She reached into her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her and took out a travel-size water bottle. She opened it and drank. She replaced the cap. She looked out the window at the dark sky and the scattered lights of the country below. Then she looked at Sarah Okafor, who had stayed near her seat, standing with the uncertain quality of someone who wants to do something useful and isn't sure what it is. Thank you, Maya said. Earlier, when you tried to intervene. She paused, selecting words with the care of someone accustomed to compressed communication. That took something. In that situation. Thank you. Sarah blinked. I didn't actually stop him, she said. I should have. You tried twice, Maya said. Alone. Without backup. A pause. That's not nothing. Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Can I get you anything? She said finally. Anything at all. Maya considered this with genuine seriousness. Coffee, she said. Black. A brief glance toward the front of the plane, where Morrison had returned. And whatever the general's having. Sarah almost smiled. I think he's having scotch. Then coffee, Maya said. Harlow did not speak for the remaining 2 hours of the flight. This was, for the people who had been sitting near him, something of a recalibration. He had been so present, so loud, had taken up so much available space with his certainty and his performed grievance, that his silence had a different weight from ordinary silence. Karen did not speak either. She had put her phone away. She was looking at her hands. In 27D, Torres had his arms crossed and his eyes closed, though his face had not achieved the softness of sleep. In 28E, Wright was reading. In 29D, Davis had his headphones on. In 30D, Kim was writing something in the margin of his textbook, and whatever it was made him smile briefly before he covered it with his thumb. Morrison had returned to first class, but had moved 3 rows back, near the curtain, where he could see economy. He opened his crossword. He did not complete any of it. He watched the back of Maya's head, the neat regulation bun, the straight line of her shoulders under the uniform jacket, and he thought about the series of decisions that had brought her to this seat on this aircraft on this specific night, and the series of decisions, her decisions, dozens of them, each one correct under conditions that precluded certainty, that had made that journey possible. He thought about the call he'd received 14 months ago on a secure line at 2 a.m., the voice on the other end flat and precise, delivering information that had made him put down the phone and sit very still for a moment before he could pick it up again. He thought about the 45 minutes she'd been alone. He went back to his crossword. He filled in 4 across and 7 down. Then he put it away, and the plane flew on through the dark. The thing about Maya Chun that was not in any file, not the classified ones, not the commendation records, not the psych evaluation she completed with the same patient competence she applied to everything. Was this? She was 27 years old. She had spent the last 9 years doing things that most people did not do and could not imagine doing. And she had done them consistently and correctly, and at significant cost to the soft parts of herself that the Army called resilience factors, and that her sister called, more accurately, her ability to feel safe. She was 27, and she was going home, and she had fallen asleep on a plane because she was tired, and a man had screamed at her, and she had woken up and handled it, and it had been handled. This was her life. She did not think of it as extraordinary. She thought of it as her job. This was, Morrison had always believed, simultaneously the thing that made her exceptional and the thing that worried him most about her. This refusal to acknowledge scale, to take up the appropriate amount of space, to believe that what she did had weight that she was entitled to feel. He made a note to talk to her about it. He had been making this note for 4 years. The announcement came at 10:43 p.m. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our initial descent into San Francisco International. Maya had been half-dozing for the last hour, not the deep sleep of before, but something lighter, still present to the cabin. She heard the announcement and stretched slightly, a movement so contained it was barely a movement, and looked out the window. The bay lights were spread below like spilled electricity. She looked at them for a long time. When the plane touched down and the lights came up and the seat belt sign chimed off, the cabin did the usual thing. Rustled, rearranged, phones emerging as 32 people simultaneously remembered the world existed. Into this usual thing came the unusual thing. The flight attendant at the forward galley picked up the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, before we reach the gate, I've been asked to make an announcement. A brief pause. It has been our honor to carry United States Army Captain Maya Chun on this flight tonight. Captain Chun is returning home after a 14-month deployment. She and her fellow service members aboard are the reason we get to live the lives we live. On behalf of the entire crew, and I hope on behalf of all of you, welcome home, Captain. Something happened in the cabin. It started quietly, a single person beginning to clap, then two, then more, until the applause filled the small space with a warmth that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with 32 people processing, in the immediate and physical way that only shared space allows, that they had been in the presence of something they didn't have adequate words for. Maya looked at the seat back in front of her. She did not look embarrassed, exactly. She looked like someone standing in rain, accepting it, but not entirely certain how to receive it. In 28E, Elena Wright put a hand briefly on Maya's arm. Maya looked at her. You got it, Wright said quietly. Maya nodded once. At the gate, as the jet bridge extended and the door opened, there was an additional complication. 4 Army officers in dress uniforms stood in the jet bridge with the airline's operations manager, who had the expression of someone who has had a very unusual last 20 minutes. 2 of them were holding flags. One was holding a small handwritten sign that read, in Marcus Torres's large and slightly crooked handwriting, home. Maya stepped into the jet bridge and stopped. She looked at Torres. Torres looked back at her with an expression of complete innocence that did not survive contact with her gaze. You called the general, she said. I don't know what you're referring to, Torres said. Marcus. I genuinely. Marcus. He stopped. He had the expression of a man who has done something he knows he'll answer for and has decided it was worth it. You needed a welcome home, he said. You always make sure we have one. You call our families. You arrange you always take care of it for us. He cleared his throat. You needed one. Maya looked at him. She looked at the sign. She looked at the 4 officers in dress uniform, at Elena right beside her, at Daniel Kim in the back with his textbook still tucked under his arm, at James Davis who was looking at the middle distance with the expression he wore when he was trying not to show what he was feeling. She looked at the sign that said home. She laughed. It came out of her like something that had been held a long time and finally didn't need to be held anymore. Genuine, surprised, a real laugh, her head going back slightly, her shoulders dropping. Torres, who had served with Maya Chun for 5 years and had heard her give orders in 6 languages and had watched her remain calm in situations that had broken trained operators, and who had not in all of that ever heard that laugh, felt something release in his chest that had been tight for 14 months. Behind them, in the jet bridge, Morrison had stopped walking. He was watching Maya laugh. He thought, good. She's still in there. He thought. That's all I needed to know. He stepped back to let her have the moment, and he was smiling to himself in a way that his subordinates would not have recognized, because this smile was private, the smile of a man who has been carrying something and set it down, and he went to find his car. Richard Harlow was the last passenger off the plane. This was partly because Karen had spent 10 minutes in the lavatory, and partly because Harlow himself had not been able to stand up and walk into the jet bridge while the reception for Captain Chun was happening. He had sat in his seat and looked at the headrest in front of him. By the time he emerged, the jet bridge was empty. The terminal, however, was not. The live stream had reached 89,000 viewers during the general's speech. By the time the plane landed, it had been shared across 3 major platforms, and 2 television crews, one local, one national, had positioned themselves at the arrival's exit. They were there for Maya. They caught Harlow instead. The airline's head of customer relations was waiting too, with a document and a polite expression that had stopped serving any social function and was now simply procedural. A representative from the Department of Defense Public Affairs Office stood to one side, for reasons that would become clear to Harlow over the following weeks. Karen held Richard's hand in the car home and did not say anything. Harlow looked out the window at the city. He thought about the pin with no public record. He thought about 6 hours alone in a collapsed building. He thought about 23 people who came home. He thought, I did not know. And then, more honestly, because he was, despite everything, a man capable of honesty when the alternatives had been foreclosed. I did not try to know. I decided before trying. He did not sleep that night. 3 weeks later, Maya Chin stood at a podium in a university auditorium and looked out at 112 ROTC cadets. She had been introduced by the department chair, who read only her name and her rank and then stepped back, because that was how Maya had asked to be introduced. The cadets applauded politely, the way you applaud someone you don't yet recognize. Maya looked at them. She had prepared, technically, 3 pages of notes. She had given speeches before, not many, and not willingly, but the army occasionally required them, and she did what the army required. The notes were in her jacket pocket. She did not take them out. Someone asked me recently, she said, why I fly economy class. She had a way of beginning that created the impression she was in the middle of a conversation you'd been part of all along. The auditorium settled immediately. The honest answer, she said, is that I don't think about it. Economy is fine. A seat is a seat. I've slept in worse places than row 28F. A pause that carried the ghost of something that might have been humor. Recently, quiet laughter from the cadets. But if there's a reason, she continued, beyond habit, and maybe there is, I'm not sure I've examined it honestly before, it's something like this. She looked at the back of the room, at the flag on the wall. When you serve, you're representing something other than yourself. You're representing the people who trust you to do the job, the people who came home, the people standing around you in economy class when you wake up, the general who didn't ask your permission before walking through a curtain to say things you wouldn't have said for yourself. She paused. You represent them, and you do not take more than your share of anything, because your share is already enormous. You've been given authority. You've been given trust. You've been given the right to make decisions that affect whether people live or die. That is already more than most people will ever hold. She looked back at the room. So you don't also need the bigger seat. No one moved. You don't need the bigger seat, she said again, quietly. Because the whole point is that when you have something that matters, you stop needing the things that don't. She stood there for a moment. That's it, she said. That's the answer. A pause. Questions. A cadet in the second row raised his hand. He looked nervous, freshly pressed uniform, young face, the wide-open expression of someone who hasn't yet learned to make himself smaller in the presence of people he admires. Ma'am, he said, what do you do when someone tries to make you feel small? Maya looked at him for a moment. You already know the answer to that, she said. He shook his head. You wake up, she said, and you let them figure out what that means. She smiled. The cadet wrote it down. Somewhere in San Francisco, in an apartment that no longer smelled like someone else's cooking, a coffee cup sat on a kitchen counter, still warm. The fog was doing what the fog does in the early mornings, running in off the bay, soft and patient and gray, filling the streets below the windows. Maya Chin stood at the window in civilian clothes, hands wrapped around the cup, watching it. She thought about nothing in particular. She stayed there until the fog burned off and the bay turned blue. and then she put down the cup and started her day.